Saeed Dai studied at the Royal Academy of Art and is an elected member of the New English Art Club and the Royal Society of Portrait Painters. In 2006, he was awarded the Ondaatje Prize for Portraiture. Saeed was born in Iran in 1958 and has lived in England since he was 6 years old.
Why did you paint me with my eyes shut?
Well, after a couple of drawings, you were having a rest and actually closed your eyes. It seemed actually even more powerful and more introspective. Even though you had no gaze, there was actually more thinking and seeing taking place. It just seemed actually a more potent image, perhaps a bit more unusual as well. But to try and pull it off so that it doesn't look like you're asleep, but inwardly thinking is what I'm trying to do. It looks more present, actually.
What's the greatest challenge with portraiture, do you think?
Well, portraiture, I think, is the most difficult idiom of all, the visual idioms. It's the most difficult to do well, and it's the easiest to do badly. The perceptual acuity that you're required is more present in trying to do a portrait than in almost any other thing. It actually pushes you up to the limits of your abilities in terms of drawing and fundamental understanding about anything. So any painter worth their salt will tell you it is the most difficult of all, and that it's the easiest to do badly. And it's in a funny sense, there is no other subject. It's quite curious, because ultimately whatever you do comes back to us. And it's a microcosm of not just the world, but also the whole of the gamut of the creative process is embodied in trying to do a portrait. So whether you want to do a landscape or a still life or even a design, it's the most acutely demanding in terms of all the visual requirements. So
You said to me once that any work of art was as much a portrait of the artist as it was of the subject.
yeah, every choice that you make is actually essentially a self-portrait. It's betraying a lifetime. So in a way, the best way to get to know an artist is essentially to look primarily for us at their drawing, which is the most naked form of getting into their mind and heart.
And a drawing as opposed to painting, you mean?
Painting is actually covered with many more layers of processes that can submerge the initial spontaneous economic mark, and it can be veiled in all manner of things and become more invisible. With a drawing, it's like a seismographic record of relationships and choices that are being made from moment to moment. It's almost like an electrical pulse, and if you're able to follow it, you can actually see the past, the present, and by implication the future in it. And it's the closest, in a way, that you can get into an artist's head and heart. For us, anyway, to study, I would look at their drawings as much as paintings.
Does your training start with drawing, ideally?
Well, I think they did, but they don't anymore. And I was lucky enough to have actually gone through art school at a time when drawing was deemed to be essential and the basis for virtually every kind of decision making. Drawing is not just a skill, it's really the way an artist thinks. And it's really your ability to make relationships of any kind. So essentially, anything that you do is a form of drawing, in the sense that you're making comparative relationships, and drawing is a means by which you come into contact with those relationships at a very basic point.
Why is it no longer taught then in art schools?
It's a good question. I think art education is a microcosm of the reflection of the world at large, and I think drawing is one of the most difficult activities of all, because it's essentially about perception, and it's not really a superficial skill as it is seen to be, and as such it demands virtually every aspect of your cognitive and intellectual abilities and emotional to succeed in it, and it's very, very difficult to teach, but historically virtually almost most of the history of art that you see has been based on a program of drawing first, or the foundations of everything else, and it's a very sad reflection that it has actually stopped now. It's virtually non-existent. They pay perhaps lip service to it, and unfortunately mechanical media has taken the place of perception, and people don't really understand the difference. And photography and other technical processes have stood in for thinking and seeing.
What would you see as the essential difference between photography and painting? I mean, most people see photography as an art, or potentially as an art.
It can. I think photography at its best, where it is actually expressing its medium at its most unique, is documentary photography, is first-hand documentary photography, which is recording. But when they start to go into the realms of art, they're actually coming into a domain whereby they are having to play around with it in the darkroom in the same sense that we're actually having to. But the problem is that photography tends not to be able to go as far as painting, in the sense that most of the history of art could not have been done with photography, and the depiction of reality is not actually to do with verisimilitude. It's not about copying, and all you have to do is to look at 20,000 years of history, and you'll see that actually very little, in a sense, can have been done from photography. It's not to diminish its impact, but a photograph doesn't really say anything about the quality of the artist's intent as much, because it's got such a mechanical intervention in between it, and you can't quite take the selective liberties. And if I can tell you a secret, is that real expression is actually to do with the degree to which you actually deviate from accuracy, optical accuracy. I'm almost reluctant to tell you that.
I won't tell anybody.
It's taken 30 odd years to actually discover this, but you can test it out and look at art in any culture and any period, and you will see that actually the degree of authenticity or truthfulness or accuracy or significance is actually the degree to which you move away from optical accuracy.
Are you saying then that with the portrait, say my portrait, you're not trying to just show what I look like?
Appearances are not so much to do with the surface as they are with the things that are underlying it. So it's the doorway through which you actually approach the other. It's a bit like writing or poetry. It's not so much about giving a report. You're trying to actually get beyond mere reportage and getting to the significance of the information or data that you're taking down. So whilst appearances are extremely important, and I'm very fastidious about accuracy in one sense, you're making very, very subtle selections as to the nature of what you deem to be important and what should be subordinate. And as such, it creates a very different image. If I was to do 10 portraits of you, each one would perhaps have a different quality or an inflection. Be very, very different. It could make it so that it is absolutely different and yet all true.
Landscapes, still lives. Is that a very different challenge, or do you see it as the same?
It's essentially the same. There are different, perhaps, considerations to take into account, but generally I draw from life. So, in a sense, what has got hold of me, and it can take form in any shape. So it can be a gesture, it could be a face, it could be a situation, a landscape. Often actually is to do with an atmosphere or a quality which may have as its source a landscape or an interior, which is the vehicle. But essentially they are about capturing or encapsulating a mood, and that's the source or the point around which you revolve. So I see everything as portraiture, actually. Everything I do is in essence a portrait, or I try.
Said, what was your inspiration? Which artists particularly inspired you?
It's a very hard question to ask. I would say all the good ones. Because there are different artists that give you different things. It's a bit like in life. Would you say there's one single person that has actually meant or given you everything, and one food that can actually nourish you in every way? There are very, very few artists that can actually give you everything. So generally speaking, there are some that nearly appear to give you almost everything, that you do need a better and a richer diet. But there are ones that, in a sense, have stood the test of time. And I think the greater the art, the more this quality of imperishability that a piece of work has, is this durability, is this quality of timelessness that you can't manufacture. And it's this sense of timelessness or just intimations of an eternity that's been managed to be captured, that is an indication of its worth, whether it's in painting or in another. So a lot of the things that are produced now are so ephemeral, they're so transient, they're so banal, so trite and vacuous, that they can't really actually compel any kind of contemplation for very long. So whilst you are producing things that are decorative and they are hopefully adding beauty in one form or another, they also have this ineffable quality of permanence, which is very difficult to define. Vermeer has it, many others. I got quite obsessed with Vermeer, so much that I actually spent over a year copying one in the National Gallery. But he's one of the most curious of artists, who almost does not seem human, in the sense that it's very hard to describe. It's a bit like Bach. If I had to compare a musician with an artist, Bach and Vermeer for me go together. They seem to have somehow gone through the utter sorrow that life has and come out the other side. And they have a sort of a seeming godlike detachment, and a deep compassion which embeds virtually everything that they do. But it is rather coolly expressed. It's which is almost a higher form of expression for me. It's not. Somebody once said to me, not enough, no, too much emotion, not enough feeling. Too much emotion, not enough feeling. And I think that is essentially what I mean, is that real detachment is actually an expression of love, because you're not attempting to influence or change or direct. You're actually seeing something for what it is.
Acceptance, you mean?
Acceptance,
Yes.
I suppose. If I had to make another outrageous analogy, I've often thought that if Christ had decided to be a painter, he would have painted like Rembrandt. But if God had decided to take up the brush, he would have painted like Vermeer. That's the essential difference. One is seemingly out of the soup, and is somehow on the other side. And they are very rare. It's almost difficult to define. But normally we are in it rather than out of it. And this is as near an expression of your ability to transcend your condition as well as you can. And the producing of art at its best sense is one of the most generous acts that human beings have ever bestowed on one another. Where would civilization be without its art? So it's not the selfish circus that it's actually turned into, this another commodity. It actually is one of the most benevolent acts. That's
Because superficially one thinks of an artist particularly as quite self-absorbed.
I think
saying that there's an element of sacrifice in being an
I
artist.
think generally what it has turned into is really another commodity, and people are perhaps, you're using your talents in order to achieve something else, whether it's money or fame, although I wouldn't advise you to be in this business for either. But generally I think looking at the best examples and looking at the world's heritage and cultures, the art is actually has been produced most generously and benevolently and compassionately by single individuals who have actually gone through turmoil, destitution, health, in order to actually achieve it, with no other sole guiding force other than their own belief that something perhaps needs to be said or done. And even now, when you have talent of any kind, people don't come out of the woodwork to support it. People don't actually water it and care for it. It's only when it gets to a point where it can be seen to be used or is commercially viable or that something can be made of it, then I think people actually become interested. So that kind of real understanding, I think, is quite rare. I know a lot of talent, even in my lifetime, that generally goes by the wayside. People will never know about, and people who have taught me, people will never generally know about on a larger scale. So the world, I think, in a sense, whilst it appears more literate and it appears more liberal and more accepting, I think is anything but. I think in previous generations they were actually better educated. You don't have the kind of patronage, knowing and discerning patronage that you did. You're really at the mercy of the mob, whether you survive or not. So all great art is an expression of love, I think.
Syed, you said to me once that there's beauty in ugliness. And beauty is not necessarily picturesque. What do you mean exactly by that? Beauty and ugliness.
Real beauty lies in the expression rather than in the subject. So you can have an ugly subject which can be transcended and made beautiful through its expression. I think you look at a Rembrandt beggar, a portrait of a beggar, in the same light as you would look at a king or a portrait of a queen. Because essentially they are dealing with this unquantifiable organization that actually comprises and becomes beautiful through relationship, whether it's color or drawing or insight. So obviously there are some subjects that are inherently beautiful, but they won't automatically become beautiful in a painting unless you bring out that beauty. So you can have a subject of war, which is everything that is but, and yet produce something that is beautiful, and yet also addressing that element too. I mean, if you look at Goya, who is looking at man's inhumanity to man, or the disasters of war, the series that he did. If you look at a Grunwald crucifixion, whilst they're depicting horror, there is an element of radiant beauty about it too, which is very paradoxical. So things are not what they seem, and only the literalist will actually choose so-called conventionally beautiful subject and imagine that it will actually translate into beautiful art.
How do you know when a painting is finished?
God. That's probably the most difficult question that an artist wrestles with almost all the time. This is a very good example. It's a painting that's been knocking around for many months. There's a lot of labour gone into it, and it's reached a point whereby I've been living with it, and it's been nagging me to finish it. And it's at a stage where, to all intents and purposes, you may think it looks quite finished, but actually it's not resolved. And perhaps it might be useful to make a distinction between finish and resolution. You can actually have something that looks finished but is not resolved. But if a thing is resolved, it will automatically be finished. And the point is how on earth do you know when something has reached its optimum expressiveness? And unfortunately, you often have to go to the end and wreck something in order to know what that point is. I think the trouble is that we're so acclimatized these days We're so conditioned to seeing the fashionably unfinished piece of work, the rough, which sort of masquerades as spontaneity, and you have to actually know what the difference is. So resolution, I think, is the most difficult, and what appears satisfactory to most people, I'm afraid there's too many structural loose ends in this for me to abide. It's been bothering me, so I've got to attend to it. I mean, I do have to get this ready for an exhibition, so it's prompted me to have to address it. It's like real relationships. You have to sit down and work them out, and it is very, very difficult, and it's very easy not to do it. So this is the problem.
One very real relationship in Said's life is with his wife and fellow artist Charlotte Sorapure. She too was a student at the Royal Academy and is also an elected member of the New English Art Club. In 2016, she was awarded the Society's Susie Roboche Prize. Among her other achievements, including solo shows in Cork Street, London, and in Bath, Charlotte won the Holborn Portrait Prize in 2012, which resulted in a portrait commission of the war photographer Don McCullum for the Holborn Museum in Bath.
What's it like, two artists under one roof?
It's a nightmare.
A nightmare.
Qualify that. Well, in many respects, it's wonderful because you have somebody with whom you can share everything. It's quite a sort of lonely activity in a way, painting, and it's good that you can appreciate similar things. You're looking in the same direction.
But I imagine you disagree sometimes.
Sometimes, but it's usually constructive. You're there to try and help one another, to be useful and supportive, and we do sometimes criticise each other's work, but it's always with a view to kind of helping each other improve something. And there has to be a certain amount of trust that that's the case, that somebody is on your side, really. There isn't any competitiveness, which people sometimes think there would be. But I'm very happy when things are successful or work well for him, and Said feels the same, I think. So.
And Charlotte, you heard what Said was saying when we were talking. I mean, is there anything you would either disagree or endorse?
I think there was something he said about the current state of the art world, and that an artist gains sort of worthy recognition, but it's something that's actually sort of used and exploited by commerce. But I think sometimes you do get somebody that breaks through, and it's a kind of a revelation and a surprise, and through their sheer sort of determination or originality or insight. And I think that it's wonderful when that happens, and people are kind of appraised and seen for their true value and worth. So maybe I don't have quite such a gloomy view about the art world. I mean, it is a pretty gloomy outlook, but I think sometimes quality does shine through, and it is recognised. That's wonderful when that happens.
You can look both ways, but generally speaking, it is difficult to maintain your aspirations in terms of quality in the marketplace. But all you're trying to do, as all artists do, is to share something, and that is an aspect of benevolence. You've seen something or you've felt something that you feel needs to have been recorded or preserved, and you are trying to share it. You're trying to communicate. I think there's quite a famous saying by Beckett. It says something like, fail again, but fail better.